The morning sun hadn't even broken over downtown Orlando when a security guard on the graveyard shift made his final round through the glass-walled office building. For most of the night, it had been quiet, just the low hum of vending machines in the lobby and the occasional flicker of a fluorescent light in the hallway. The place always looked eerie at 3 in the morning, the kind of silence that pressed on your chest. But at 6:30, as dawn began to bleed into the skyline, the guard reached the 12th floor and noticed something strange. The conference room door was half open, the light inside still on. He hesitated before pushing the door fully ajar. The scene that greeted him would sear itself into his memory forever. A woman's body lay sprawled across the long mahogany table, her blouse torn, her arms dangling limply off the side. Blood had soaked into the carpet, pooling beneath the chair legs, thick and dark. But it wasn't just the gore that froze him in place, it was the absence. The woman had no head. Where it should have been was only jagged flesh, a raw horror framed by the office's polished, sterile decor. He stumbled back, clutching at the wall, his walkie-talkie slipping from his hand as his voice cracked over the radio, calling for help. By the time the first patrol officers arrived, the building had become a crime scene. Yellow tape stretched across the lobby entrance as startled employees, showing up early for work, were ushered back outside. No one could believe what they were hearing. This was supposed to be one of the city's most successful real estate investment firms, a place of glass offices, power suits, and high-stakes deals. Not the backdrop for something out of a nightmare. The victim was quickly identified, 29-year-old Vanessa Clark, a junior administrative assistant who had worked there less than 3 years. Young, ambitious, and well-liked, she had spent the previous evening in the office, supposedly staying late to finish a quarterly report. Detectives soon discovered something else. The company's CEO, 45-year-old Richard Monroe, was nowhere to be found. His sleek black Mercedes, usually parked in the executive lot, was gone. His cell phone went straight to voicemail. At first, officers wondered if he had simply left on an early business trip, unaware of the chaos unfolding. But when they checked security footage, the unease deepened. The cameras covering the 12th floor had gone dark around 11:37 p.m., as if someone had deliberately switched them off. And the last digital record of Richard's access badge showed him entering the building just minutes before the blackout. The case had all the markings of scandal: a high-powered executive, a young employee, and a body mutilated in a way that screamed message rather than accident. Whispers began spreading even before the press arrived. People wondered if the rumors were true, that Vanessa and Richard had been more than just boss and subordinate. Co-workers exchanged uneasy glances, some claiming they had noticed closed-door meetings late at night, others insisting they'd seen the two leave the office together more than once. None of it felt solid, but in the shadow of the gruesome discovery, every piece of gossip sounded like evidence. For the detectives standing over that blood-stained table, one question loomed larger than the rest. Where was Richard Monroe? If he was innocent, why had he vanished? If he was guilty, how far would he go to protect the secrets buried inside his company's gleaming walls? The investigation had barely begun, but the hook had already gripped the city. News vans crowded outside the glass tower as anchors spoke into their cameras, their voices hushed with disbelief. Within hours, the story had a name: the Headless office murder. And in Florida, a place already known for bizarre headlines, this one managed to shock even the most jaded. What began as a quiet morning patrol had turned into the opening chapter of a mystery that would unravel lies, expose hidden affairs, and drag powerful men into the light. Vanessa's body, headless and brutalized in a place meant for business deals and coffee meetings, was only the beginning. The story of how she ended up there, and what really happened inside that 12th floor conference room was about to unfold. Vanessa Clark had grown up on the outskirts of Tampa, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a mechanic. She was the kind of young woman people described as determined more than lucky. At 29, she carried student loans like a shadow and worked 2 part-time jobs before finally landing her position at Monroe & Associates, a mid-sized but fast-growing real estate investment firm in Orlando. For Vanessa, the job felt like a ticket upward, her chance to step out of the paycheck-to-paycheck grind. She was smart, organized, and had an easy smile that made her popular around the office, even if some whispered she was trying a little too hard to impress. Behind that smile, though, her life was more complicated. She had ended a rocky relationship just months before her death. Friends recalled late-night phone calls where she vented about arguments, about being accused of cheating, about feeling like she was always in someone else's shadow. When the relationship finally collapsed, she moved into a small apartment near the downtown business district. It was convenient for work, but lonely, a space where the silence sometimes felt heavier than the city noise outside. Debt collectors left messages on her voicemail. Credit card balances climbed. Vanessa wanted more than stability. She wanted success, security, and maybe a little glamour. That was where Richard Monroe entered the picture. On paper, Richard was the archetype of the self-made businessman. A polished executive in crisp suits, salt and pepper hair, and a smile tailored for boardrooms and press photos. He founded Monroe & Associates 15 years earlier with a modest loan, then turned it into one of Florida's more aggressive property investment firms. To the public, he was a model of ambition and discipline. To those who worked under him, the story was different. He was charismatic, yes, but also ruthless. His temper could cut through a room, and his charm, when turned on, felt less like warmth and more like manipulation. Richard was married, with 2 children in private schools and a lakefront home that made magazine spreads. He attended charity galas with his wife, appeared on local business panels, and gave speeches about leadership. But inside the office, he had a reputation for blurred lines. A few women who left the firm hinted at inappropriate advances, though nothing ever stuck. In industries fueled by image and money, power often insulated him from real consequences. When Vanessa joined the firm, Richard took notice. She worked hard, stayed late, and always seemed eager to take on extra tasks. At first, he praised her in front of colleagues, complimenting her efficiency and drive. Then came the invitations, staying behind to finish paperwork, grabbing drinks after a long day. Vanessa confided to one friend that she knew it was dangerous, but admitted the attention was intoxicating. She wasn't naive. She knew what it looked like, but she also knew the access it gave her. To the inner circle, to decisions that shaped the company, to promises of advancement she couldn't get anywhere else. Their affair didn't play out in cheap motels or out-of-town trips. It unfolded in the very building where she worked. After hours, lights dimmed, blinds drawn. The same conference room where her body would eventually be found became their meeting ground. Coworkers noticed she was leaving later and later, often long after the rest of the staff had gone. Once or twice, an assistant swore she heard laughter behind a closed office door well past midnight, but nobody dared ask questions. Gossip in an office can be as dangerous as evidence, and in Richard's firm, loyalty, or at least silence, was the currency that kept you employed. Still, some couldn't help but notice the changes in Vanessa. She began wearing more expensive clothes, showing up with new jewelry, even talking about trips she couldn't possibly afford on her salary. For those closest to her, it was clear she had stepped into something more complicated than an office romance. She had begun straddling 2 worlds, the hard-working assistant scraping by, and the woman who knew secrets about her boss that could topple everything if spoken aloud. Richard, on his end, seemed more distracted. His meetings grew shorter, his temper sharper. He missed deadlines on major projects, something unheard of for him. Some of his executives whispered that he was stretched thin, maybe gambling too much on risky deals. Others suspected personal trouble, though no one dared link his unraveling discipline to Vanessa. The stakes at Monroe and Associates were too high. People kept their heads down. By the summer before her death, Vanessa was telling friends that she finally had leverage. She had evidence of something inside the company. Emails, spreadsheets, late-night conversations she hinted were worth more than her paycheck. She laughed about it, but those who heard her couldn't tell if she was joking. What was clear was that she had tied herself to a man who was both her greatest opportunity and her most dangerous secret. In the glittering world of real estate and high finance, where image was everything, their relationship was the kind of scandal that could destroy reputations, careers, and families. It was also the kind of scandal that left Vanessa exposed. When she was found the way she was, headless, brutalized, in the very conference room where their affair had unfolded, it was impossible not to draw a line between her private choices and her violent end. And with Richard Monroe missing, that line seemed, at least in the public eye, like a straight shot. Detectives arrived on the 12th floor just after sunrise, the hallway already crowded with uniforms and crime scene technicians. The air smelled faintly metallic, the sharp tang of blood that no amount of air conditioning could mask. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, cold and sterile, but the room itself looked like something from a nightmare. The long conference table, polished to a sheen only yesterday, was now streaked with dark stains. On the carpet, the imprint of high-heeled shoes trailed off toward the door, interrupted by a sprawl of crimson where Vanessa Clark's body had fallen. What drew every gaze, however, was the grotesque absence at the top of her shoulders. Whoever had killed her hadn't stopped at taking her life. They had taken her head. Detectives knew instantly this wasn't a random break-in or a crime of passion that burned out too quickly. This was deliberate, staged a shock. The fact that it had happened in a corporate boardroom, under the glare of recessed lighting and glass walls, only heightened the surrealism. Detective Carla Hughes crouched near the body, her gloved hands hovering just above the evidence markers. She'd worked homicide for 15 years, but this scene pulled her stomach tight in a way she didn't admit aloud. Vanessa's blouse was torn, one sleeve twisted halfway down her arm. A broken wine glass lay on the floor, its stem snapped clean in two. There were smudges of lipstick on the rim, fingerprints partially lifted in the sticky residue of spilled Merlot. On the table, 2 empty bottles stood side by side, their labels gleaming under the fluorescent light. "Looks like a meeting for 2, Hughes muttered, her voice low enough that only the crime scene tech beside her could hear. The implication was obvious. Whoever had been in the room with Vanessa hadn't been there for business. The first sweep revealed something else, attempts at cleaning. Near the doorway, streaks on the carpet suggested someone had tried to mop up blood with a rag or towel, leaving faint drag marks. The trash bin in the corner was empty, too clean, as if someone had removed its contents in a hurry. Yet for all the effort, the job was sloppy. Drops of blood spotted the hallway outside, leading to the stairwell. It looked rushed, panicked. The building surveillance system should have provided answers, but the 12th floor cameras had gone dark at 11:37 p.m. sharp. When technicians pulled the feeds, they found nothing after that, just static like someone had intentionally cut the line. But the system in the lobby had continued recording. At 11:15 p.m., the footage showed Richard Monroe swiping his badge and entering the elevator. After that, no sign of him leaving. His Mercedes was gone from the parking garage, but no camera had captured the moment he drove out. Downstairs, the medical examiner arrived and began her preliminary assessment. Vanessa's cause of death, she explained, wasn't the decapitation itself. The wounds on her neck were post-mortem, cleaner than the jagged defensive cuts on her forearms. She'd likely been struck first, one decisive blow to the side of her skull with a blunt object. After that, she'd been incapacitated, then killed with a long, sharp blade. The precision suggested more than rage. It suggested calculation. Time of death was narrowed to between 11:30 p.m. and midnight. That timeline presented a chilling contradiction. Richard was last seen entering the building before 11:20 p.m. But if he left without being caught on camera, how had the system failed to record it? And if he was gone by then, who had stayed behind to finish Vanessa off? Detectives canvassed the floor, noting that only Richard's office and the conference room showed signs of recent use. His computer was logged in until 11:29 p.m., then abruptly shut down. On the desk, a tumbler of whiskey sat half empty, condensation still on the glass. A monogrammed cufflink was found under the chair near Vanessa's body, engraved with the initials RM. It was the kind of evidence juries liked. Too perfect, too easy. As Hughes took it all in, she felt a ripple of unease. Headless bodies carried symbolism. They weren't just about silencing someone. They were about sending a message. But to who? A jealous wife? A betrayed business partner? Or the world at large? To warn anyone who might threaten secrets buried in Monroe and Associates books? By mid-morning, the building had been cleared of all employees. Crime scene tape sealed off the executive floor. Outside, reporters clustered with cameras, shouting questions that no one inside could yet answer. But the whispers had already started. An affair gone wrong, a cover-up unraveling, a CEO on the run. For Hughes and her team, the evidence felt like a puzzle where every piece pointed to Richard Monroe, yet none of them fit cleanly together. The badge swipe, the missing car, the cufflink, it all said guilty. But the streaks of attempted cleanup, the missing footage, the precision of the killing, it felt like someone else had been in that room, someone with just as much to lose. And as the body was finally zipped into a bag and wheeled toward the elevator, the weight of the case pressed down on everyone present. This wasn't just another homicide. It was the opening volley in a battle that would expose not just who killed Vanessa Clark, but the dark machinery that kept Monroe and Associates running behind closed doors. The manhunt for Richard Monroe began before the sun went down that same evening. His face, once plastered across real estate magazines as a visionary CEO, was now on every news channel in Florida. Helicopters circled above the Orlando skyline. Reporters camped outside the glass tower of Monroe and Associates, and police cruisers combed the highways leading out of the city. The narrative was irresistible. A young woman found headless in the office conference room, her boss missing. His luxury car vanished into the night. Detective Carla Hughes led the task force. Her first priority was to trace Monroe's movements after the last security footage. The black Mercedes had exited the garage undetected, something only possible if someone tampered with the cameras or if the system had been disabled from within. Either way, it suggested inside knowledge. When state troopers checked traffic cameras across I-4, they spotted what looked like Monroe's car heading east toward Daytona Beach around 12:45 a.m. After that, it disappeared. A warrant for his arrest was issued, citing probable cause for first-degree murder. But Hughes wasn't satisfied. To her, the pieces felt too clean. Monroe's cufflink by the body, his whiskey glass still sweating on the desk, the camera blackout that coincided perfectly with his arrival. It was either the sloppiest crime by a wealthy man who thought himself untouchable, or it was a setup by someone who wanted him buried. As investigators dug deeper, the story widened. Financial auditors called in by police began combing through Monroe and Associates' ledgers. What they found wasn't just sloppy accounting. It was fraud on a scale that could topple the company overnight. Offshore transfers disguised as consulting fees, shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, real estate flipping that existed only on paper. Tens of millions of dollars were unaccounted for. The FBI, already sniffing around Monroe's deals, now had every reason to join the investigation. Vanessa Clark's role in all this grew clearer with each passing day. On her personal laptop, detectives found an encrypted folder labeled insurance. Inside were screenshots of bank transfers, internal emails, and draft letters addressed to Richard Monroe demanding money. In one, she wrote plainly, "You promised me more than jewelry. Pay me $50,000 or I go to the board." The timestamp was just 2 weeks before her death. Co-workers began talking. Some described Vanessa as ambitious to the point of recklessness. Others painted her as vulnerable, a woman in over her head with a man who had too much to lose. One assistant admitted she had overheard Richard and Vanessa arguing in his office late at night, his voice rising until the walls rattled. Another claimed Vanessa confided she was done being played, that she had leverage and wasn't afraid to use it. The manhunt stretched beyond Florida. Tips poured in from Georgia, the Carolinas, even as far north as Virginia. Sightings of Monroe's car came in daily, most turning out to be dead ends. Then a break. His credit card pinged at a gas station in Savannah. Surveillance footage showed a man in a baseball cap and sunglasses buying water and snacks. The build and profile matched Monroe. By the time police arrived, he was gone. While the search continued, Hughes followed another trail, Richard's inner circle, that led her straight to Anthony Vega, the firm's vice president. Vega was the opposite of Monroe, short, stocky, perpetually sweating through his shirts. He'd been with the company since the early days, loyal but often overlooked. Recently, though, he had grown more aggressive in board meetings, pushing to take on projects Monroe seemed hesitant about. On paper, Vega had everything to gain if Monroe went down: control of the firm, access to its accounts, and distance from the scandal that was already consuming his boss. The financial audit revealed his fingerprints too. Vega had signed off on many of the suspicious transfers. When pressed, he claimed he was just following orders. But investigators noted he seemed far too comfortable explaining the web of shell corporations, as though he had designed it himself. By the end of the second week, the story had become a feeding frenzy. Local anchors called it the Headless office murder, while national outlets picked it up as a parable of corporate greed and sexual exploitation. Commentators debated whether Monroe was a cold-blooded killer or the victim of a corporate coup. Every night, Hughes watched the coverage and felt the weight of time pressing down. If Monroe was guilty, he was a man capable of slipping away forever. If he was innocent, someone else was orchestrating a masterful frame job while the world focused on the missing CEO. Then came the twist no one expected. A forensic deep dive into the conference room revealed a partial fingerprint on the broken wine glass. It wasn't Monroe's. It wasn't Vanessa's either. It belonged to Anthony Vega. The discovery cracked the case wide open. Now the investigation wasn't just about finding Monroe. It was about figuring out whether Vega had manipulated everything. Had he killed Vanessa to silence her? Had he planted Monroe's cufflink and whiskey glass to frame his boss? Or had he simply been another player in a company where lies, sex, and money tangled into knots too tight to untangle? The manhunt for Richard Monroe intensified, but the narrative was no longer so neat. Florida had started the week looking for a runaway CEO. By week 3, it was clear this wasn't just a murder. It was the exposure of a financial empire built on fraud, betrayal, and dangerous secrets. and whoever had cut Vanessa Clark's head from her body had done so not just to kill her, but to keep those secrets buried. Detective Carly Hughes had built her career on catching liars. In her experience, the truth never unraveled in a straight line. It came out in stutters, in contradictions, in small details that didn't quite fit. And in the case of Vanessa Clark, the details began to trip over one another. The first break came when the digital forensics team re-examined security logs from the building. Everyone knew the 12th floor cameras had gone dark at 11:37 p.m., but what most missed was the system's error log. At 11:35, someone with administrative access had keyed in a command to shut down the feed. The credentials belonged not to Richard Monroe, but to an IT manager who hadn't been in the building for weeks. Someone had stolen or spoofed his login. That pointed to planning, not panic. Meanwhile, the blood trail leading out of the conference room had bothered Hughes from start. It dripped into the hallway, then toward the stairwell, but abruptly stopped. No head, no weapon, no bloody cleanup rags were ever recovered. It suggested someone had carried them out of the building in a controlled way, possibly in a bag. Witnesses began to surface. A cleaning contractor swore he saw a man with a duffel bag leaving through the side exit around midnight. The problem was, he described the man as short and heavy-set. That didn't match Monroe at all. Then came the forensic report. Forensic tests confirmed the cufflink carried Monroe's DNA, but no traces linked it directly to the struggle. Hughes dug into Monroe's last known timeline. Security footage showed him entering the building at 11:15. His computer log-off came at 11:29. The coroner's estimate placed Vanessa's death at roughly 11:45. That left a narrow gap. Could Monroe have killed her and fled in under 15 minutes? Possible. But when Hughes pressed her team, they admitted the probability was thin. The head removal alone would have taken longer. It was beginning to feel like Monroe wasn't the only player in the room. Attention swung back to Anthony Vega. The partial fingerprint on the broken wine glass was his. When confronted, Vega claimed he had been in the conference room earlier that evening for a budget meeting and must have handled the glass then. But staff interviews contradicted him. No one had seen Vega past 6 p.m. that night. When Hughes subpoenaed his phone records, they showed a flurry of calls around midnight to a number traced to a burner phone. That burner was later found in a dumpster 2 blocks from the office. More troubling, Hughes uncovered a quiet transfer for the company's Cayman account to Vega's personal shell company, dated 3 days before Vanessa's death. The amount, $200,000. Prosecutors speculated it could have been payment to shut someone up or to hire someone to do the silencing. Still, there were other threads that refused to be ignored. A neighbor of Vanessa's came forward with a diary she had left in her apartment. In one entry, dated a week before her death, she wrote, R. thinks he can scare me, but I have more than one option. If he won't pay, it will. Either way, I'm not leaving empty-handed. The initials could have been Richard, or Anthony, or both. The diary also described meetings Vanessa had outside the office with a man she referred to only as the fixer. He promised protection, but only if she handed over documents. Investigators struggled to identify him, whether he was a private investigator, a hired enforcer, or even a government informant. The fixer never surfaced, but the fact Vanessa had mentioned him suggested she was juggling more danger than anyone realized. By the third week, the case file read like a tangle of motives and half-truths. Monroe had the affair, the missing car, and the vanishing act. Vega had the fingerprint, the burner calls, and the financial incentive. And somewhere out, there was a missing head, a missing blade, and possibly a third man whose name no one knew. Hughes stood in the empty conference room one night after the scene had been cleared, staring at the shadows cast by the city lights outside. She imagined Vanessa sitting here, sipping wine, believing she finally had the upper hand over men who thought they could control her. She imagined Monroe, tense and desperate, worried about his empire crumbling. She imagined Vega, scheming for power. And then she imagined the silent figure who had carried out the final act. The person who had picked up a blade and turned an affair into a headline. The deeper she went, the less certain she became of the obvious answer. Evidence pointed at Monroe, yes, but evidence also lied. And as the weeks passed, Hughes realized the real story wasn't just about who killed Vanessa Clark. It was about how many people wanted her gone. 3 weeks after the discovery of Vanessa Clark's body, the manhunt reached a climax. At dawn in a quiet neighborhood outside Savannah, Georgia, U.S. Marshals surrounded a modest rental home where neighbors claimed a man keeping to himself had been living under the name Robert Mays. When the door burst open, they found Richard Monroe barefoot in the kitchen, his gray hair unkempt, his expensive watch still on his wrist. He didn't fight. He raised his hands, muttering, "I didn't kill her. You have to believe me." The arrest made headlines coast to coast. Images of Monroe in handcuffs, let out by federal agents, played on repeat across cable news. Commentators framed it as the fall of a titan. A wealthy CEO, once invited to charity galas and business forums, now reduced to a fugitive accused of murder. For the public, it seemed like an open-and-shut case. He'd run, and running meant guilt. But for Detective Carla Hughes, the arrest felt like only one layer of a deeper puzzle. Monroe's trial began nearly a year later, drawing massive crowds to the Orange County Courthouse. Reporters camped on the steps, protesters carried signs that read justice for Vanessa, while others shouted conspiracy theories about corporate cover-ups. Inside, the courtroom hummed with tension. Prosecutor Carlin Gwynn, known for her sharp delivery and meticulous preparation, stood across from defense attorney Samuel Breyer, a seasoned litigator hired with what remained of Monroe's fortune. The state's case leaned heavily on motive and circumstantial evidence. Gwynn painted Monroe as a man cornered, an extramarital affair with a young employee, financial fraud closing in, and a woman threatening to expose it all. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said in her opening statement, "Richard Monroe had everything to lose, and Vanessa Clark was ready to take it from him." That night, in the very office where he built his empire, he silenced her forever. The prosecution showed the jury the cufflink engraved with RM, the whiskey glass, the security badge log, and the timeline that placed Monroe in the building just before the blackout. They emphasized his disappearance, arguing it was proof of guilt. They read aloud Vanessa's encrypted messages demanding money. The jury listened, their expressions hardening. But Breyer wasn't about to let the state's story stand unchallenged. His defense strategy was clear, plant doubt, and lots of it. He highlighted the sloppiness of the evidence. The cufflink was too clean, too conveniently placed. The cameras were disabled using stolen IT credentials, not Monroe's. And then came the bombshell, the fingerprint on the broken wine glass. Breyer hammered it over and over. This was not my client's fingerprint. This was Anthony Vega's. If Mr. Monroe was the killer, then how do we explain that? Gwynn countered by arguing that Vega could have touched the glass earlier, but Breyer wasn't finished. He called witnesses who testified to seeing a short, stocky man leaving the building with a duffel bag. He showed the phone records tying Vega to burner calls at the exact hour Vanessa was killed. "This case is not about my client," he told the jury. "This case is about a frame job designed by men who stood to gain everything if Richard Monroe went down." The courtroom buzzed as the defense suggested Vega had orchestrated the murder, planted evidence, and set Monroe up. Yet Monroe wasn't innocent either. The defense admitted he had run, but framed it as panic, not guilt. He was being hunted by the press, his company collapsing, his marriage in ruins, Breyer said. He fled because he was afraid. not because he killed. Then came a testimony that shifted the entire trial. A forensic specialist explained that the cut wounds on Vanessa's body were consistent with a ceremonial-style blade, long, thin, almost like a decorative sword. Detectives had recovered such an item during a search of Vega's office, a steel saber he displayed as part of a corporate award from years ago. Microscopic analysis showed trace blood proteins embedded near the hilt. It was Vanessa's. The courtroom gasped. Vega was subpoenaed to testify, but he pleaded the fifth. His attorney scrambled, arguing the saber could have been contaminated later, but the damage was done. Nguyen, sharp as ever, pivoted. She argued that Vega may have wielded the weapon, but Monroe was still complicit. He knew what happened. He allowed it. He covered it up. That makes him just as guilty, she pressed. Breyer fired back. The state wants to have it both ways. Either my client murdered Vanessa Clark or Anthony Vega did. The evidence shows Vega's hands all over this crime. The state wants you to convict two men for one act, but justice doesn't work like that. The trial stretched for 6 grueling weeks. Jurors sat through hours of financial records, expert testimony, and emotional statements from Vanessa's family. Her mother sobbed as she described her daughter's last phone call, where Vanessa said, "I finally have something that will change my life." The jury saw photos of the crime scene, bloody carpet, broken glass, the absence of her head. The images left them pale, shaken. In closing arguments, Nguyen urged them not to be distracted. Richard Monroe ran. He lied. He betrayed. Even if Vega's hands held the blade, Monroe's hands held the leash. Do not let him escape accountability. Breyer, in contrast, leaned into the doubt. You cannot convict a man on suspicion alone. If Vega killed Vanessa, and the evidence screams that he did, then how can you send Richard Monroe to prison for life? After 4 days of deliberation, the jury delivered a split verdict that stunned the courtroom. Vega, tried separately in a rapid proceeding that followed, was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. The forensic evidence against him was overwhelming. For Monroe, the jury acquitted him of murder but convicted him of financial crimes, fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy. The judge handed down a 20-year sentence. He would serve it in a federal facility, stripped of his wealth, his company dissolved, his name forever linked to the scandal. As the gavel fell, the courtroom erupted, half in outrage, half in relief. Vanessa's family wept, some feeling betrayed that Monroe had escaped the murder conviction, others simply grateful that someone was held responsible. Reporters flooded the courthouse steps, microphones thrust into every hand willing to speak. Detective Hughes walked out quietly, slipping past cameras. For her, the verdict was bittersweet. Justice had been served, at least on paper. Vega would never walk free. Monroe would never reclaim his empire. But Vanessa Clark was still gone, her life cut short, her secrets buried with her. And somewhere, out in the world, her missing head remained unfound, a chilling reminder that some truths never surface, no matter how many verdicts are read. The trial was over, but the echoes of the case refused to fade. Even months later, the glass tower on Orange Avenue remained half empty, its logo stripped from the facade. Monroe and Associates had collapsed almost overnight. Employees scattered, resumes flooded the job market, and the building that once symbolized ambition now stood as a monument to greed, scandal, and blood. At night, the 12th floor stayed dark. No tenant wanted it. No cleaning crew lingered there longer than necessary. For Vanessa Clark's family, the end of the trial brought no real closure. Her mother still set a plate at the dinner table on holidays, whispering prayers under her breath. Friends gathered for vigils, clutching candles, their faces wet with tears as they repeated her name aloud so it wouldn't be forgotten. But the wound was rawer because her body had never been returned whole. The missing head was a void too painful to fill, a permanent reminder that some part of her was still out there, lost or destroyed. The public seized on that detail. Headlines kept returning to the office beheading case long after verdicts were read. Podcasts dissected every angle, speculating about why her head was taken. Was it to silence her? To terrify others who might expose the company's secrets? Or was it simply a grotesque flourish by a killer who wanted to make a statement? Theories spread like wildfire, each one darker than the last. In online forums, strangers debated whether Richard Monroe had ordered the killing or whether Anthony Vega acted alone. In living rooms, families shook their heads at the madness of it all. How an office affair could spiral into something so horrific. For Detective Carla Hughes, the case lingered like a stone in her chest. She'd chased killers before, but this one gnawed at her in a different way. She had helped put Vega behind bars, had watched Monroe get stripped of his empire, yet the feeling of an unfinished puzzle haunted her. Somewhere in the evidence, in the gaps between testimony, was the answer to what had really happened in those last moments of Vanessa's life. Had she tried to bargain one last time? Had she begged? Had she realized too late that leverage cuts both ways? Hughes replayed it in her head during quiet nights, knowing she'd never have the truth. Richard Monroe adjusted quickly to prison life, though not without bitterness. Reporters who visited him in federal custody noted that he still carried himself like a CEO, shoulders squared, voice measured, as if giving a quarterly update rather than discussing the ruin of his life. They wanted a villain, he told one journalist. I was convenient. Yet even in his denials, he never escaped suspicion. To the public, acquittal on murder charges didn't erase the stain. To many, he would always be the man who seduced his assistant, ran from the law, and stood silently while another man did her in. Anthony Vega's fate was harsher. Convicted of murder, sentenced to life without parole, he faded into the prison system. For a man who once schemed for power, his empire shrank to a concrete cell and a number on a roster. He never confessed, never explained, never offered a hint of remorse. If he had answers about Vanessa's missing head, or if he knew more about the fixer mentioned in her diary, he took those secrets with him. Time moved on, as it always does, but the story remained a cautionary tale. In corporate seminars, speakers warned of ethics lapses, using Monroe and associates as a case study. In true crime circles, Vanessa's name became shorthand for the dangers of ambition entangled with secrecy. And in Orlando, where the skyline glitters with new glass towers, people still point to that 12th floor and whisper. Epilogues rarely deliver justice the way families hope. Vanessa's life ended in violence. Her dreams folded into a scandal larger than herself. In the years that followed, her story sparked conversations about workplace exploitation, financial corruption, and the fine line between power and abuse. She became more than just a victim. She became a symbol of how quickly ambition and desire can turn lethal when secrets are weaponized. And though her family still waits for the day someone uncovers her missing head, the city has already built its memorial. The memory of a young woman who thought she had found a way to climb, only to be dragged down by the very people who promised her opportunity. In the end, the story of Vanessa Clark is not just about one murder in an office tower. It is about the lies that fester in the spaces where money, sex, and power meet, and how those lies never stay hidden forever.